Sorry for the technical difficulties. I think we can get going. So, hello, Game Dev Day starts.
Let's welcome him first.
Okay.
And again, coming all the way from Vienna.
All the long way, yes. Thanks for being here, and it's been surely a long day, so I'm going to try to make it somewhat snappy. I'm going to talk about the art of Old Man's Journey. But first up, quick introduction. My name is Clemens Scott. I'm the co-founder and creative director of a small Viennese studio called Broken Rules, which is run by 5 co-owners, but was initially founded by Felix, Jan, and Peter, these 3 guys. And back in 2007, they made a game called And Yet It Moves. And in 2009, the studio was officially founded, and in early 2010 is when I joined, and Martin as well. And as a team of 5, we created a game called Chasing Aurora, which was a Wii U launch title, and then the follow-up on PC called Secrets of Rayticon, which was released in 2014. And now, a few years later, Felix and I made a game called Old Man's Journey, which released last May. It is a touch-based puzzle game where players guide an old man on his last big journey by shaping the landscape and creating intersections between hills which he then can cross. But when we started out, the game didn't look like this. The game looked like this. No? Not coming. There we go. It's up. Loading. Oh, there we go. This is it. This is what it looked like. So you have this little pink figure walking over the intersections to the blue goal post, and that was the first introduction level to introduce you to the intersecting mechanic. And we had no idea what the visuals of the game were going to be like. We basically had total creative freedom, which is great. But choosing the direction of a project that will dictate most of your wake time for the next years and your financial future demands to be a well-considered decision, right? So creative freedom is basically the reason why I chose to found and run my own studio. But the more freedom you have, the harder the choices are. So luckily there are tools. Introducing the box, which is really just a metaphor for setting yourself constraints based on your abilities and the situation that you're in. It's not really particularly a new concept, but it's one of the cornerstones of why Old Man's Journey looks the way it does. So before we really started, we already started constructing this sort of box, and there are 3 main ingredients. One is constraints, the second one is goals, and the third one are strategies on how you are going to reach your goals. And to narrow down your constraints, you can ask yourself 3 questions. One is, what are the games that you want to make? What are the games you're able to make? And what are the games that currently have a market? For us, games that we want to make have these things: cultural value, sort of push the boundaries of the medium, offer unique experiences, things like that. Games that we're able to make are usually 2D games, because all of our previous games were 2D games. They usually have a strong aesthetic, build believable worlds that players want to spend time in. And games that currently have a market don't push the boundaries of the medium, at least not too hard, but offer a unique experience and have high production values. So these are the interesting ones, where the overlaps are. So once you got your constraints narrowed down, you can think about the goals that you have with the project. In our case, we wanted to create a premium, high-quality, one-time experience type game that connects with the players and has mass appeal without compromising its artistic integrity. The second was to create a game so beautiful it will stick out of the mass and make editors want to decorate their storefronts with. Because that means features, and features are good, right? And also we wanted to make a game that is so accessible it can be enjoyed by a wide audience and uses the simplest form of input, like a single touch. And also that has no text and no reading and no localization. Essentially, we wanted to create a game for the reading nook, which is sort of like the place where you go to at home when you just want to, you know, read a good book, have some quiet time, and be by yourself and enjoy what you're doing. So now we had our goals together, but we needed a strategy of how we wanted to achieve our goals. So one strategy was that we were going to tell a simple story that everybody can relate to, only using images. The core theme of the story is family, which is a topic that everybody can relate to in one way or another. And the story itself is told through animated vignettes that look like this. So this already satisfied two goals. Something that's very good to look at and that is accessible. So another strategy was to align every element in the game to an emotional progression curve, which is also something that we took from somewhere else. That game company used this method on Journey and Flower, and in our case, this curve looked like this. So at the bottom you have the levels, at the top you have the story, bits, elements, and this is sort of the way the player progresses through the game and sort of the emotions that we wanted to convey, and in the ideal case even for the players to feel as they are playing the game. And finally we wanted to build a world with lots of whimsical details and rich interactivity, and obviously assemble a team of excellent collaborators with whom we would be able to pull that off. And basically this is it. This is the box that we then kind of like used as a tool to align any decisions that we would make while developing the game to those constraints and goals. But this still doesn't really explain how we got from this to this, which is still the same level. It still has the same intersections, the same setup. Because the first mock-up we made on the game, while we were still sort of like putting our box together, it actually looked like this. So our previous games were very vector-based, or visually very influenced by vector drawings. And since the prototypes also had these very clear shapes, it was sort of like an obvious step to take that into the visual direction. So everything was sort of informed by gameplay ideas. We had to make it readable. We had to have these intersections that are clear. So this is a second mock-up that I made. Also, as a bonus, in the second mock-up for the game, it also includes the very first character design of the old man, who was an egg-headed, potato-nosed, bold clown with a tiny backpack and a jumpsuit. So that was obviously that was obvious that this design was not going to cut it, so I played around with that a little bit more and came up with this sort of super stylized vector variant of some old farmer, but we didn't really know anything about the protagonist. We didn't know anything about the old man, who he really was. And even like this mock-up key art was sort of based on readability concerns and core gameplay. But the problem was that did not like satisfy this emotional hook to the player that we wanted to create, because intersections are just nothing very emotional. So we decided to hire Lip Camarella of Salon Alpine, who we collaborated with throughout the entire game. And he did some concept art, and his approach was radically different. So this was his first sketch. And he didn't give 2 cents about readability or gameplay or anything like that. His approach was purely about vibe and emotionality. which suited much better for what we had set out for. You can see there's also already the sketch of an old man that is pretty close to what he looked finally. This was, before that we actually started working on the character of the old man a bit more, and we created sort of this chart with relationships and personality traits and things like that. And after that, Liv started sort of sketching out the character and putting that into this mock-up piece. And this character design up here is already like pretty close to the final thing. So we really liked the results and asked Liv to do a couple of more mock-ups of what the game could actually look like in a level itself. And he did that, and we really liked it. We liked how much texture it had and how much this painterly look. It fit very well, but it still wasn't quite there. It was still quite a bit distant to what we would want gameplay-wise, and also a couple of things were really we imagined really difficult to do technically. And also, since I was going to be the lead artist, it had to be a style that I would be able to pull off. So basically I went back to a prototype level, which is this one. Introduces the waterfalls, which act sort of as a conveyor belt downwards. So when the old man walks through the waterfall, he kind of like falls down, and then he can go to this blue flag. And coming from the gameplay side, I tried to apply those things that Lip did in his mock-up, and came up with this, and found the results to be pretty mediocre. It was just a little bit uninspired, and I didn't have that. It just didn't really catch on. So instead of doing something patently, I thought, what if we tried to do something in 3D? You know, you never know. And I came up with this. I played around in Blender for a little bit, and actually kind of liked the results. I liked the lights and the shadows and the vibrant colors. And so I thought, okay, this is pretty neat. Maybe we can experiment with this a little bit more. In this shot, the camera is pretty close to the player, so I wanted to experiment with a little bit more extreme distances where the player is further away. So I came back to this level again. And another issue also was that we eventually wanted to get rid of that blue flag and replace it with something that was more in the world. But the problem was that we didn't know what to put there instead. The game just always, the flag always seemed too gamey, and we just wanted to get rid of that. So in the next one, I tried to tackle both issues, and I came up with this. And it definitely already, we really liked it, again, like from the colors, and it supported some of the ideas that we had for our box already much better. But it still lacked a lot of the details that we wanted it to feel rich. Concerning the signposting, I replaced the flag with a little town village where it could go. But also, he would be like really, this, you can see this has more extreme distances, and he would be like on the last hill, it would be really tiny walking up to the village. So we already saw that this might be like a little bit too far away. But also, again, I was kind of stuck in terms of the art direction, because as I said, it did lack the details that we wanted to have, but I'm not such a good modeler that I can do this really fast. So I was kind of stumped, and I started thinking about other things. And at the same time, I stumbled across a music video called Latin Boys, which was produced by an animation studio in LA called Encyclopedia Pictura. And I really liked the video, so I started researching about who made it, and saw that the art director made concept art for the music video that looked like this originally. And that inspired me to go back to my own roots, which is drawing, and mostly line drawing actually. So that resulted in me going over the 3D mock-up just with a line drawing, which then looked like this. And I added colors to that from the mock-up, and I got this. And it already did contain the richness that we wanted. Actually, it maybe even went overboard a little bit. But I really liked all the small stuff that was going on in there. You know, you can really imagine like those little wine pickers walking around, picking the wine, putting it into the backpack, bringing it to the truck, or like a little sheep running around, all this stuff. These are the things that we wanted to have in there. But still, I felt the outlines were making everything a little bit too cartoonish for my taste, and I actually eventually wanted to get rid of that again. So, trying to go further from that, I started thinking, okay, well, this village, if that is the goal of this level, and he was walking there, then logically, like the next step would be that the next level would be inside of the village. What would that look like? And again, I went back to one of the prototypes. This is a puzzle where the player learns that these dark gray areas cannot be shaped, and the hills that you're standing on cannot be shaped either. So the player has to walk on that, pushes up, and then he can finish that. So these are like static blocks in the level. So I was wondering what those could be in the game. And coming back to the idea of the village, I thought, well, maybe these actually could be houses. So I roughly sketched this village with houses over the same scene, and thinking about signposting, better signposting, I extended that sketch on the top and the bottom. And the idea was to let players feel like they were actually entering that little village, walking in at the bottom and kind of like moving upwards to a very specific goal, right? So up there's no real other way to go, and it tells you, okay, you're there. And that meant that we all of a sudden had went from single screen puzzles to a moving camera, and that was sort of like, this blew our mind a little bit. It was like, oh wow, we can extend this in all directions, and we can, you know, parallax scrolling and all these fancy effects and cool things like that. But also the designs of those houses, they didn't come out of nowhere. When we were thinking about that village and what that village looked like, my partner Felix came up with this image of an Italian town called Cinque Terre. And that immediately clicked, because one of our goals was to get players want to spend time in the world and want to be there. And when we saw this image, it was like, wow, yeah, I want to do vacation there, like right now, you know. I want to check out what all the little, you know, streets in this village are. And that very much inspired this little sketch. Because then after I had that, I extended it up a little bit more, because I kind of like the bookmark feel of that, and I put down basic colors. And this is actually where it clicked for the first time. Like when I showed this little tiny thumbnail to Felix, we kind of knew we were onto something. The colors needed to work for the environment, but they also needed to work for gameplay readability. So the hills actually are the one magical thing in the game. This is why they can have sort of like magical colors. You don't have, you know, when you look out the window, you don't usually see blue or red hills like that. But we could pull it off because it fit into the general theme, and they are sort of like the special magical objects. So I started detailing it and putting down more colors and getting to a point where I called it done. And this was it, basically. And also talking about inspiration and getting stuff from somewhere was not only that one picture. There's also this picture, and when you look at that, especially like the top right one, and then you look at this, it's actually quite similar, so you can already see where that is coming from. But that was it. That was basically the benchmark of where we wanted to go, like even without the details. This is what we used to communicate from then on to everybody else of what we wanted to do. But the question still was there, if we should go for 2D or 3D. The advantages of 3D were still tempting, especially now that the camera moved around. and questions of landscape moving and moving intersections appeared, things like that we had to think about. So we decided to give 3D another shot and try to make this in 3D and test it out. So I blocked these shapes and a tiny bit of environment, slapped some textures on it, and put it into this sort of like mock-up level like that. And we did kind of like the results. It had a nice feel to it, but I felt it was still too geometrical, and the edges still looked too clean. So we invested some more time into figuring out if we could come up with a shader that would sort of like distort the edges of the 3D models a little bit to make it look more painterly, but never found the results really particularly convincing. The rest of the team leaned towards the 3D option, while I leaned towards the 2D option. I felt we had to give it another chance because the 3D version actually had a little bit more detail than my 2D mock-up. This is the 2D mock-up at that point. This is the direct comparison. So this was 3D, this was 2D. So I went back and essentially added a little bit more detail to the 2D version, which then looked like this. And this is already pretty close to the final look. And then we had to decide what are we going to do. And we came up with this whole list of pros and cons, what it meant for the production pipeline and all these details. And in the end, we came up with a tie. And we still didn't know which way to go. And so we consulted our box. And what says the box? We have experience making 2D games. We have no experience making 3D games. So that was a pretty good indicator. But I also felt that the natural stroke of painting that stuff actually supported the mood or the tone of the game a lot better. But in the end, it still ended up to be sort of like a gut decision. You still don't really know how everything else is going to work out going that way, but at some point you just have to jump into it. And we still played around. We kept making experiments using 3D objects in the 2D world, but decided against using 3D models for most of the game. But technically, it's still a mixed technique because behind the scenes, our levels look like this, or like this. So as you can see, it's all basically layer after layer, and everything is flat in the world. And this idea actually informed one of the core rules of the art direction of the game and the art styles vocabulary. Everything's flat, nothing has volume, and the light is pretty much always from top to bottom. This can easily be seen if you take out a single asset, like a bush, which we start out with just a flat shape, add a gradient and a couple of details on the top and the bottom, add another layer on top of that with the same ideas, and finally add a third layer. And then you have the final bush, and it's also comprised of all these single layers just basically flat, stuck on top of each other. So that was good, but we also soon realized that was going to be a little bit difficult to implement because we have all these different environments. So having one single green bush wouldn't work out. We couldn't like hue shift that in the game. So we did actually, to reuse generic assets like bushes and stones, we created a monochrome version of that and colored them in Unity using a color wrapper. So we got pretty good results that looked like this, but it also could look like this or like this if we wanted. So we were able to do all kinds of crazy different things. But still, so I kind of like moved forward a little bit, getting piece by piece together on what the art direction was going to be like. But I still struggled when coming up with new objects. For example, I tried to make a tree, and it just didn't work out. And I painted around and things. So I went back to Lip and I asked him to do like a tree for me, and he came came up with this. And I liked a couple of elements of that, but he always wanted to give things volume. He always liked sort of dramatic light situations, but that was something that we couldn't do for the game because we had static lighting. And so I took a couple of things from that and modified it, and eventually came up with this. And we all really liked this, so we decided to put it into the game. We cut it up in different pieces, like the stem and the top parts in various pieces, reassembled them in the game using physics, resulting in this. And there we have it, bouncy trees. So that was good, but what about characters? What about character design for the game? I created my first mock-up for characters look like that. And that was kind of okay, and it kind of worked with the art style, but I asked Lip for feedback on it, and he made an iteration that looked like this. And that was much better already. It was easier to read, it had clear shapes, it followed the same rules that the character design of the old man has, and it follows the rules of the art style. Like one of the things is having gradients or color variants from bottom to top. And it was also easier to animate, which was good. So let's take a look at the rest of the environmental design. When we start out with a level, we usually have a sketch that looks somewhat like this. So it describes a simple puzzle in the game. And then we kind of like start sketching over that, adding ideas and putting something over there, and then we take a part of that and sketch that on a different sketch and start sketching over that. And a few days later, when you look at that, you're like, what is even going on here? I have no idea. So it's sort of important once you settle for something that you want to do is to make a clean sketch of that. That is not the same level right now because I didn't keep the sketch, I think, but this is sort of what the line work of that looked like. So it's also important to start thinking, after having like only gameplay, it's important to start thinking about the environmental design. What kind of things would represent certain puzzles? How would you do it? How would you represent it visually and still keep the gameplay aspects clear? So that was a constant push and pull between the level designer, which is Felix, and me as the decorator of things. So especially in the beginning, that was a pretty chaotic and very iterative process. But usually we start with a sketch, then prototype the level, then did other sketches on top of that, and sort of like got moved forward from that. And it was also always important to check with where the level would be placed along our emotional curve. So we knew what the mood in that level would be like. We usually assemble a mood board like that for a specific type of level, and then create a quick mock-up like this afterwards, and then get back to the actual level. So this whole process became a little bit more streamlined later on when we already had all of our puzzles together, and then we kind of just made of the different scenes in one level. We made screenshots and stitched them together in Photoshop, and then sketched on top of that, which then usually looked like this. And we already kind of like knew which elements worked and which didn't. And since the levels always need to support our emotional curve, it was important to already put that into the environment design that we're thinking about. So, for example, the theme of this level is sort of everything is going down, and that is sort of, you have these waterfalls, but also in the story things are kind of like going downwards, and we try to visually represent that in the game. So this is the next step without the screenshots. This without the camera views, and things are starting to get a little bit clearer now. When we start to put down colors, trying to make sure that the colors never like the same color never line up while still keeping one color scheme, and adding details and diffuse color variations, and usually also a couple of gradients, and putting down the shadows, and then in the end kind of like putting some adjustment layers on that for a better mood progression from top to bottom. And then add some trees and some details, and that's basically the finished mock-up. With this, we will take that, and then we said, okay, now we're going to go back to the level, and we're going to try to implement that on top of that prototype of the level that we have right now. And the way that works is that we essentially create set of textures. So all of these hills are actually flat meshes. On top there's a spline that can be shaped, and then on top of that mesh we put down one texture. Usually that worked in a way that I set up the textures like this, and then I passed it on to our support artist and animator, who did lots of the background rendering to actually make it look good, like this. So this is one of the shots in between, sort of where we started to put textures into that level to make it come closer to what the mock-up looks like. The same thing goes basically for adding props, like for example this pile of rocks here. Before it was just a sort of like gray block, and then we put down a pile of blocks. I did the basic colors and the sketch for it, passed it on to Brian, who then rendered it to actually make it look good again. And we kept on doing that until we resulted in something like this. At some point we also put down the interactive or the movable objects, like a tree was something that is again compiled of the physical object that we then place in the level. And this is basically how we got to the way the game looks. This was the process of how we got through that, and yeah, I hope that gave you a little bit of an insight of how we made Owen's journey. And that's pretty much it. Finally, to come back to the box, so those constraints there are a great tool to help you make decisions, but there's still a lot of manual labor and experimenting involved. Also, the box should sort of like stay flexible. We didn't set it up in the beginning and it was static, but it kind of like evolved and developed as we worked on the game. So it's important to give a box sort of like some time to evolve. That it took quite a while until we had all of our goals and strategies compiled into that list that I have here now. And also it's good that the constraints, goals and strategies sort of like complement each other, that they work well with another. Contradictory constraints and goals will stay contradictory up until the end of the game when it is released. For example, if you're going to make something, like if you want to make a game that encourages playful curiosity, but you also want to make a game that has permadeath, those two things probably won't work too well together, because every time the player tries something and you bash them over the head with permadeath, they're probably going to stop experimenting too much and be very careful. So yes, this is pretty much it. Closing off here now. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks for being here. Also, of course, questions.
Thank you so much.
Have
Questions? Any questions? Yes, please.
What are your personal influences as an artist? Like it reminds me of like some like the sketches remind me of like French comics or something.
Yeah. I did read a lot of French comics, but I don't know if it wasn't necessarily like a specific influence, but I feel that pretty much everything you consume in a way comes back to influence what you're doing. It's always kind of like this whole big sort of filtered through the brain, but it was not a specific influence.
And more questions?
I can just shut it up. So when you know that, like, you did so much amazing concept art, but when, how do you decide to be done with that? Like, it seems incredible, all the little details and details. Like, when do you feel, okay, well, how do you make the decision?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so how I make the decision when a concept art is done, or well, that is mostly limited by time. I usually say, okay, I want to make a mock-up, and that mock-up shouldn't take longer than a day.
No, I mean for the entire project. Like, when do you feel, okay, this is it?
That actually is a process that just takes a while, and it actually, I think I really felt it was finished when we were done with about, I don't know, 70 or 80% with the game. So that's definitely something that's sort of fluid in a way. But at some point, like in the first 10%, you just have to go with something. You can't, dabble around forever. At some point, you have to say, okay, this suits, this how do you say? This checks all the things of our goals that we want to do. Does it support that? If we use those constraints and goals as a tool to ask questions about the art style, does it support that vibe that we wanna get? And if the answer is yes, then you basically just roll with it, and all the iterations on top of that come with as you work on it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have follow up.
Yeah, sure.
Did that, because that's like the third or fourth project by now?
Yes. Yeah, of course.
So did the point where you were confident with the art, has that sort of changed from project to project and in one direction, or was it just?
Absolutely. So the process of finding an art style has always been very different for every project.
You say there's a progression that you have become a more confident decider on that sort of.
I think so. I think so the question is if it has changed over the process, over the project, when I decide that an art direction is basically done, right? Okay. That has been different between every project, but I do feel that I have learned a lot from previous projects, just in terms of how do I set it up to be able to get results quicker. So things like tools like that, for example, or how you set up, like who you're working with. In this case, usually it was 5 people working on a project. In this case, it was just me and Felix, and it was our thing, and so we could align much faster of where we were heading. And using these tools, we were also able to tell quicker when we are at a point of where we wanted to be. But it still took, like this whole process took about, finding the art direction took about, I think, like 3 months or something like that in total. So that also often needs a little bit of time to, sometimes you just need to put it aside, and then you do something else, and then you need time to do some research, because in the end it was like that video that I stumbled across randomly gave me inspiration to try something else, and I needed that time to be able to basically sit on YouTube and watch videos and then go ahead and do some research on that, and stumble across something where you're kind of like, oh wait, hang on, I could try that, and so I think the calendar time is something that you shouldn't underestimate in those things.
So would you recommend to watch more YouTube?
Absolutely, anytime. All right, one more question.
You talked about finding the color schemes for the different levels.
Right.
Kind of personal question: did you consider people with color deficiency while making the color schemes?
Not to the extent that we changed gameplay based on it, because usually what we did was, so yes and no to answer your question. The thing is, when you desaturate everything to monochrome, you still need to have your values that work. And if your values work, then you don't necessarily need to watch out for your color scheme in that regard so much, because it is such a slow game. It is anyway, the game is, you know, you cannot die, you have all the time in the world, there is no failing essentially, so it is not really that important that you're able to read the colors immediately, because as long as the values work, you can sort of actually figure out that there's even like a support when you move the hills, you get an outline on your hills, and you even get a little dot of when intersection is created, because sometimes there's just a lot of stuff going on, like a bush here and a stone there and whatnot, and then it becomes anyway difficult to read. So that's always a trade-off between very natural looking environments and something that just purely works on a gameplay basis. Does that answer your question somewhat? Okay.
Okay, so I think the other questions we have at the video session you mentioned.
All right. Yeah. Also, what is the venue? MOX, M-O-X-X, for those that know. Yes,
we
right.
will walk there all together.
Oh, okay, yeah. Perfect.
Let's thank our closing keynote again.
Thank you very much.
Is this also our closing of this event? Sorry.
No, should I move away? Get off the stage!
Just a second. Oh no, I don't have to.
Okay, so this is the time to say some last words. So first of all, so everyone who is going with the bus tour tomorrow, so it will be fantastic. We are super excited and we will have lots of wine. So last year I think we had 3 wine tasting things and everyone was very drunk again.